Hey everybody, and welcome back to Front-End Expert. In this video, we will be discussing responsive design and how we can use CSS media queries to make our websites more responsive and scale better to different screen sizes. So here in this example, we are using a CSS grid layout very similar to the one we saw in the grid video. At the top of the body, we have a header with the H1 top-level heading, and then we have a nav with navigational content. We have a main element with a main heading and a main content paragraph. And then finally, we have an aside and a footer, each of which have a paragraph. And then if we go into our styles.css, you can see we have set the body to be display grid with 3 columns and 3 rows. And then we use grid template areas to define which elements are going to appear in which cells of the CSS grid. Now this output looks fine, it seems to be working, and we've used grid, which we know is a responsive system, and we use the FR unit, which we know is a responsive unit that's going to grow with the size of the viewport. So what's the problem here? Well, the problem is that our grid layout just won't make sense on a smaller screen. So in Chrome, it gives us the option to choose a screen size within the developer tools, and we can use that to resize this window and see that it's not scaling well at all. It's just sort of zooming out. And if we get small enough, we're not going to be able to see almost anything. Now, of course, nobody's going to have a 50 pixel wide phone or browser window, but the idea is there that the smaller that this screen is getting, the worse that this output is starting to look. So let's see if we can fix that. The first thing we need to do is actually to go back to our HTML file. And in the head of our HTML file, we need to add a meta tag. And we saw this meta tag in the HTML crash course, and we can give it a name of viewport. And what this meta tag is going to do is define the way that the viewport is going to scale. So we can say content equals width, and this width is going to be device width. So we're saying that we want the width of the screen to be whatever the width of the device is, and we want the initial scale to equal 1. And we can go to a new line here as well, just so that things are a little bit easier to read. And again, we talked about this meta tag in the HTML crash course, so I'm not going to go too in depth on it here. But as a reminder, this is simply a way to tell the browser that I wrote responsive CSS, and I want that responsive CSS to be honored rather than just zooming out the screen as a user's browser gets smaller and smaller. But with that in mind, we have to actually write the responsive CSS. So now let's come back over to our styles.css file. And what we need to do is add media queries. And what a media query does is it lets us say that we want to run a piece of CSS based on a condition. And usually these conditions are minimum and maximum screen sizes, but there are actually a ton of different media queries that we can use. But that said, here we are going to be focusing on the size of the screen. So down here at the bottom of our CSS file, we can add our first media query, and we'll use the @ sign and then media. And then in parentheses, we will say what the condition is. And in this case, let's say that we want a max width of 800 pixels. So if the user's browser is smaller than 800 pixels, we will go into this media query. But if it's over 800 pixels, this condition will be false, and we will just move on and not run this code at all. So in the case that the user has a smaller device, so smaller than 800 pixels, we want to change the way that our grid layout is working, and that is on the body tag. So inside of the media query, we will add a body selector, and then we can change the grid layout. So I'm actually going to go back up to the body tag and just copy the grid layout code, and we can paste it down here into this body tag and change it how we want. And usually what we end up doing on smaller screens is making it a single column layout. So for now, what I'm going to do is make this just one column. So one FR as the only column, and then we need to make the rows reflect the sizes of the different rows we will want. So let's say that the header is going to be first as 1FR, and then we'll have the navigation element below it also 1FR, and then we can have the main content still be 3FR, and then we can have the aside go below that with 1FR, and the footer as 1FR below that. And next we can change the grid template areas to reflect that. So first we have the header. Below the header, we will have the nav. Below the nav, we will have main. Below main, we will have our aside. And finally, at the bottom, we will have our footer. And now we can save this, and you'll see nothing has changed. But if I resize the browser window, once it gets below 800 pixels, you'll see it'll flip to using the single column layout that is following what we said in the media query. And next, we can actually start combining media queries. So we can use multiple media queries on the same page based on different screen sizes. So I'm going to add another media query below here, and this one's going to be for even smaller screens. So let's set a max width on this one and say this one's going to be 600 pixels. And inside of this 600 pixel max width, we want to be even more concise with what we show the user. And if we look at our output, we can't make it less columns anymore because we only have one column, but what we can do is actually hide some information. So for example, the aside, we know just based on the fact that this is an aside tag, this content's not that important. So we might want to just not show it. And of course, there's a content design debate to be had here about whether or not we should be hiding information just based on a user's screen size. And really, we should probably be showing it in a better way. But for the purpose of demonstration, let's go ahead and hide these aside tags on these very small screens. So we could do display none to completely remove that aside from the page. And then we will need to fix our grid as well to reflect this. So we can also add our body tag here, and then we can copy the grid template rows and the grid template areas and paste them into this body tag, except the only difference is we will remove the aside and we will remove the row for the aside in the grid template rows. And now when we save this, you'll see at the smaller screen size, we aren't even showing the aside, but as I make the screen bigger, eventually the aside will show back up, and then as the screen gets even bigger, it will go back to our 3-column layout. And if we did go back to the HTML file for a minute and comment out this meta tag we added just to show what exactly this is doing, now if we were to scale down this browser, you'll see it doesn't actually change. It doesn't use the media queries at all really, because as the browser window is getting smaller, what tends to happen is it just zooms out the page for you. But when we include this meta tag, our media queries will be completely working as we expect. So as a general debugging tip, if you are adding a bunch of media queries and they don't seem to be doing anything, a first thing to look at is, do you have this viewport meta tag added to make sure that it is respecting your responsive design? And finally, I wanted to talk about a concept known as mobile first design. And mobile first design essentially means to build a website that is optimized for mobile first, and then we can use media queries to make it work on larger browser windows second. And this is the opposite of what we have done here. In our styles.css, in the body tag, we set up the grid for a larger screen, and then we used the media queries at the bottom to affect smaller screens. And this is fine. There's nothing wrong with doing it this way, but the idea of mobile first design is sort of twofold. One, it's that if something is optimized for mobile, it will scale up to a larger screen naturally, better than something optimized for a large screen will scale down to mobile. And also, more and more of the internet is being consumed on mobile phones, so it makes sense to optimize for those first. So if we wanted our CSS to follow this mobile first design principle, one thing we could do is we could take our grid template for mobile and we can just move it into the main body tag up here. And then we can take the larger screen setup for our grid and we can move it down into our media query. And we'll remove this columns as well. And then we can change this max width to a min width. So now we are saying if there's a minimum width of 800 pixels, so if we are larger than 800 pixels, go into this media query. And then at the bottom, we can just leave this max width of 600 pixels for now. But you could imagine if you had built this website with mobile first in mind, you might have built this version first and then used media queries for each incrementally larger website. And you'll see the output for this will actually work the exact same. Nothing is going to be any different. All we have done here is just moved some CSS around, but of course, if we wanted this to be an actual mobile first design, we would have designed the mobile website first, and then from there worked on the larger screen size versions. And with that, that's going to be the end of this video on responsive design. CSS media queries are super powerful, and there's a lot you can do with them to make amazing websites. So I highly recommend you are using them as often as possible to make sure that all of the websites you build are responsive on as many device screen sizes as possible. So I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you in the next one.